Welcome to the Flowably podcast with Dr. Diana Hristova and P. Fraser. If it's your first time tuning in, I'll let you in on a little secret. You are participating in a live book writing session. We will be publishing the book Psychedelics Without Drugs next summer, and these podcasts are actually live interviews for the book. If you, dear listener, want to help shape the story, please contact us at our website, flowably.io, and share your thoughts, insights, new topics you want to hear, or even a better title for the book. This week, I'm joined by David Youssef. David is a co-founder of the Guild of the Rose, an educational organization that provides a variety of workshops focused on community-based self-improvement. Listen closely to hear David's incredible story from dropping out of college to becoming a successful business owner, how flow may be our natural state of consciousness, and much, much more. We're live, David.
Howdy.
So right before we started, David and I got on a tangent of talking about Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. Let's start us off, David.
So in Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, one of the biggest insights he gave me in that book is that it literally costs you caloric energy to focus on something you don't want to do. When you're bored, you have to do your taxes, for example, it actually costs you twice as much energy as you think. It takes you energy to do it, but it also takes you energy to keep yourself focused on it. Mm-hmm. So what happens when you're doing something where either you have 100% accepted, there's no way to avoid it, or you actually enjoy it very deeply and you don't need to force yourself to do it? Suddenly, you have twice as much energy to do it, and there's no internal resistance, and you can just exist there. That's flow state. Like, that's the technical definition of what flow is. It's not that flow is the state we're trying to get into. It's the opposite. Flow is the natural state we're supposed to be in. And then when we force ourselves to do things that are, how do I say this? So Nassim Taleb uses this really great quote in the book Procreatus Bed. Procrastination is the soul rebelling against entrapment. And so what I think Kahneman is pointing out here is that when your soul is not entrapped, when you're not feeling bored, or that you're feeling that ugh field, I'm trying to procrastinate on something, you go into flow naturally. It's what we're supposed to be in.
Okay. So I've heard flow described as sort of a state of consciousness, and I think Stephen Kotler is the one who calls it an altered state of consciousness. But if we think about it as sort of the baseline that we should be in, how do we get ourselves into that state of flow more often?
Well, I have what I call the building the pearl system. Mm-hmm. So again, this is based on Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, and this was my reasoning a few years ago that led to the creation of the Guild eventually.
Okay.
My first thought was, okay, if what Kahneman is saying is true, thinking deeply about stuff is very costly. Being in your system 2 mind that thinks deeply is like working out. And I've been on a fitness journey for the last 2 years, and I can tell you a 1-hour workout destroys you if you're doing it properly. And I've also been doing engineering classes, and the truth is, after an engineering final, I feel very similarly. Your brain uses 40% of your calories. So if all of this is true, you've got 2 hours of good thinking in you per day. Maybe if you're exercising, you're doing nootropics, you're firing on all cylinders, you got 4 hours at the best.
Okay.
And then the rest of the time, you're on autopilot, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's the case, you don't want to waste your best thinking time forcing yourself to do something boring or doing things that are not really productive for you. Mm-hmm. So what I started doing is I asked myself, okay, if I have 4 hours of thinking today, let me ask myself, what am I going to do the other 20 hours tomorrow? And can I use my intelligence now and smear it across those 20 hours so that the time I'm not thinking runs a little bit more smoothly? When you do that...
Continue.
If you do that often enough, like a pearl that grows because of an irritation in an oyster, every time you have a problem in your life, you'll notice it, spend the next 2 or 3 days thinking about it and just be like, how can I smooth this over so this never becomes a problem again? And you reduce friction every day slowly. And as you reduce friction, you open up more energy to go into flow state more often.
So what does that 4 hours of deep thinking feel like? Could you describe sort of the feeling of that?
I'm imagining this is incredibly individualized, but for me, the experience is always inputting information kind of casually. There's probably never a moment where I'm not consuming some sort of information or media unless I am specifically going into silence mode for deep thought.
Mhm.
And then honestly, it's meandering in its play. Like, I think we believe that deep thought has to be this like intense, rigorous struggle. But the same way that playing basketball is both exhausting for your body and fun, or
Mhm.
martial arts is, deep thought should be fun. It's playful. I mean, one of my favorite examples of this is when they asked Einstein, how did you come up with your special theory of relativity? He's like, well, I had a job at a patent office, so every day I would practice like thinking abstractly about complex problems. But when I was on my lunch break, I would just ask myself fun hypotheticals like, okay, we know light has like a maximum speed. What if I was on a train going at light speed on the roof and then I like stood in front of myself? Could I see myself?
Yeah.
It was just a playful thought experiment.
Yeah.
We take life too seriously in some ways and not seriously enough in others, but I think I'm rather anachronistic in that way.
Yeah. So it's a state of getting into play. But I really like your analogy to the baseball of it's exhausting. So kind of when you come out of it, you're probably like, whew, that was a lot. But in the time you were kind of firing on all cylinders, and maybe did it have some of those characteristics, or does it have some of those characteristics that are traditional to flow states, like selflessness, timelessness, those sort of very rich environments?
So for me, flow state almost never happens when I am intellectualizing or theorizing or planning things through.
Mm.
Flow state is when I am doing. Like, so I'm on here to talk about the guild, and I would say that this is a big dichotomy that I'm trying to address, which is doing is when people are in flow state. Thinking shouldn't be in flow state. Thinking should be kind of the opposite of flow. It should be kind of a grinding thing where you really puzzle things out, but it should be fun, like a jigsaw or figuring out, I don't know, for me, cooking is a good example. The like planning out a recipe is not flow state. Cooking is flow state. If you do it
How
right, your planning stage should be done to design your process so that you can get into flow state as good as possible.
Okay. And how much of personal development that you guys focus on at the Guild, if I can umbrella all of your activity under that, how much of it is planning and how much of it do you say, scrap the plan, like let's just go for it, let's get our hands dirty?
So you need both. And this is one of the things that I really emphasize, which is a lot of the people from the rationalist community where many of us started are some of the most brilliant people on earth. I am constantly humbled by how smart these people are, and I am like, oh, I could be your pet. This is not great. On the other side, they just there is, I think, a kind of perfectionist indecisiveness that comes from an academic and theoretical background.
Mm-hmm.
Where on the other side, I actually dropped out of college when I was like 20 and did like 10, 15 different like jobs per year. I think I've had like over 35 jobs in 10 years. It's insane.
Okay.
And then I went back to college. And now I'm back. I am one semester away from getting my bachelor's in biomedical engineering, and I have an associate's in
Congratulations.
engineering now, thank God. But like those 10 years really made a big difference because I realized that oftentimes the plans are just wrong. And you should be
Mm-hmm.
a good scientist and good engineer. And instead of making these elaborate plans, make one small step, experiment, get the results back, iterate, go again. So
Is
that's
that
kind of the our process. You make a plan, And the most important priority is how quickly can you implement this and get feedback. Not how perfect is the plan, not how great is it, but can you have a good metric and get feedback quickly? And then you come back with your cohort, the group of people you've been working with all over the world who have similar goals, and you guys share results. And I think that that was kind of our biggest insight, which is we live in a very lonely, individualized age. And I'll be honest, I do a lot better personally when I have social accountability, and I think a lot of people do.
Walk me through, because we've touched on a lot of the aspects of the guild, but I guess walk me and the listeners through the concept of the guild, maybe what it was when it started and what it has transformed into.
So I would say that the story of the guild is that from across the country, starting in like 2009, Eliezer Yudkowsky created the rationalist community through his works online known as the sequences. It's like 3,000 pages of rationality. It's absurd. And then there was a big diaspora where everyone kind of scattered online. And a bunch of us noticed that rationalists are just very bad at like actually doing the work of becoming better people, making the world smarter. And they can't work together. It's like wrangling cats. It's horrible. I've been on podcasts complaining about it. One of our other founders, Matt, wrote like entire articles about this and posted them places. It was very intense. And then when COVID hit, we all kind of reached out through the Bayesian conspiracy Discord online and realized like, oh, some of us had community-based versions of this, but we need to make something online that can scale. And our mission is to raise the sanity waterline for the world, which is a term I really like. Have you ever met someone who is batshit bonkers? And it's not their fault. Let's be honest. It's not their fault. They were probably in a bad environment. No one taught them to think rigorously. And yet society is somehow not only allowing them to be okay, but to thrive. I don't want anyone to do badly, but it's kind of a negative sign in our society that, like, we accept a certain level of crazy, isn't it? Like, that should send up red flags.
Well, talk to me about crazy for a second. Do you mean sociopathic, of like they seem normal on every level, but then you get down to the deeper and you're like, whoa, this person's nuts? Or they're nuts on the just surface level and nothing they do is rational?
For me, you're right. That's a good question. I should clarify. Nuts means that they don't understand how beliefs work and what their words mean. So a good example is, do your beliefs pay rent? So this is a term that we really emphasize as well. When you say you believe something, how does that belief change your predictions for the future and therefore your actions? If I ask you what you believe, and then I give you the hypothetical that imagine that somehow someone proved you completely wrong tomorrow, how would your life change? If there is no change, you don't really believe it. It's an accessory. It's a waste of your mental energy even processing it, because doing so is taking away valuable calories and time you could be contributing to the world. Now, I'm a wizard. I have a little altar behind me. I worship the Monkey King. I'm very okay with some woo-woo, but you must be okay with saying, like, is there a real change in your belief structure, in your actions? Because otherwise you don't really believe anything. That's what I mean by crazy. There are people in this world, prominent people, who sincerely think that just by saying something, it means something, but it doesn't. Your actions are what mean things.
Okay. How does a belief in your mind connect to a core value? Because I know a lot of personal development from speaking to other people comes from, you got to build a foundation of core values, let's say, figure out who you are, build on top of that. How do you guys link beliefs in personal development?
Oh, I kind of go the opposite way.
Okay.
I believe that you should start with this slow process of just picking a shallow goal. You don't need to make deep, perfect goals. Just work on any level of improvement. And doing so will give you the confidence through practical experience of being like, oh, I can change. I can become better. Let me explore other possibilities of who I can be. And I think that people, again, this is the planning fallacy. People want a perfect plan of who they're going to be, and then they want to act on it. I'm like, no, scrap that. Just, if you're not sure what to do, go pick weeds for your neighbor. Literally, just go be a nice person, do that for a while, and it will reveal itself to you through the actions you've taken. You'll scratch your own itch of figuring out what bothers you through the act of any self-improvement.
And was it the process of your 30 odd different jobs that you had after school? Was this the learning process that you had of figuring out, all right, I'm just going to do anything and figure out how it aligns to my personality?
Yeah, like, and you discover that you're a lot more flexible than you think you are. I have seen people in my own life be thrust into situations where it was sink or swim, and it's terrible that people are put into that, but they've changed entirely. I think one of the most revolutionary jobs in my own life was I was a canvasser for about 9 months in Philadelphia. That meant I put on that yellow vest and I go up to random strangers and be like, hey, do you have a minute to talk about Save the Children? People threw bottles at me, people
Yeah,
spit at
they
me.
weren't
It
happy.
was brutal. But you know what? I was like, I'm bad with money. I'm awkward. Well, when I needed to pay the bills, I learned real quick I could be charming. And there is something that psychologically happens when you're like, I can convince someone to give me their credit card number on the street in 3 minutes or less.
Yeah.
That's a skill that people think is magical, but it's just something I learned most people can do. But you just have to go through that really rough period of learning it.
Okay.
Once, the more of those things you do, the more confident you become that you can actually be whatever you want. And then you have the confidence to deliberately choose, like, what kind of person do I want to be now that I have the choices and the options to explore whatever I want.
And understanding the flexibility that you have, even if you might make the wrong choice to begin with. Do you see in the initial steps people say, oh, I keep making the wrong decision, I'm not finding what I want out of this process of doing these
All the
random personal
time.
development tasks?
All the time. And then that's why the cohorts really help, because oftentimes before any of us in the council or any instructors have to say anything, their cohort mates will be like, hey, have you thought about this way? Have you tried it in this manner? Things that oftentimes we as teachers would never have thought of, which is really, really gratifying, honestly. And more importantly, I always try to impress on people, like, one of our symbols is the compass rose. And the point of having a compass is not that you're going to get to your destination perfectly, but no matter where you go, you have something that you can check in with that will point you back in the right direction.
I like that. I want to dive a little bit deeper into it. It takes a certain type of personality to go through what you did, which is dropping out of college, working 10 years of random jobs, and then turning around and saying, all right, I figured out this system and I now want to impart it on as many people as possible. Like, it takes a certain personality to want to raise the sanity line of the world. And I'm curious how you saw that develop within you. Like, were you just like that from the age of 5 onwards? Or were there
Oh,
things in
God,
your
no.
life that led to that?
No, I was kind of the opposite. I always joke that for a lot of people in the rationality community, finding those works was like a breath of fresh air. Like, one of our founders and one of my closest friends, Errol Heiberg, who was a nuclear engineer in the Navy, is one of the most brilliant people I ever met. And he's the one who introduced it to me, and I could tell that was his experience.
Okay.
For me, it was the exact opposite. I was training to be a lawyer or a priest or a businessman, all careers that essentially teach you to be very linguistic but not very rational in the true sense.
Okay.
And in the community, they call them the dark arts because you can use them whether or not you're telling the truth.
Yeah.
So I read the sequences and it felt like a gut punch. I was like 19 to 20, and every time I would read an article by Eliezer Yudkowsky, it felt like he was calling me out specifically. He's like, are you the kind of person who tells yourself these kind of lies to feel good? Well, then you should feel bad, and this is how it's going to fuck up your life. But I am just too arrogant to stay wrong for very long once someone has told me so. Like, it bothers me. And then honestly, my life kind of went to shit. after I dropped out, I was in a really bad place. I was selling drugs for a while. I got arrested. Things were really bad. And the worst part was, I had read this material, so I had no one to blame but myself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there was no ability to hide whose fault it was. It was me. So I went through the hard work of slowly trying to rebuild myself and rereading this material and thinking about it deeply. And I realized that I got really lucky. When I was arrested, it was because I had some roommates who were doing some dicey things. They were good guys, but it was rough times. And I only had like a little bit of marijuana on me, so I got like a slap on the wrist. But one of my roommates got like a permanent federal mark and stuff, and he was a great guy, one of the most brilliant people I've ever known. I like to surround myself with very smart people.
Okay.
And I was like, it's not fair that there are people in this world who are so smart and who have no structure and no system to help them rebuild themselves when things are bad. And I wanted to help fix that problem.
Hmm. I guess I'm wondering if you could explain the rationalist point of view or the rationalist theory in sort of one sentence. Maybe that's too wide of a metric, but
It's too wide, but I can give you at least the core insight that I think started all of this.
yeah.
So, Eliezer Yudkowsky, very smart man. Everything he's ever written is free online in the book Rationality from AI to Zombies.
Hmm.
But what he really pointed out to people is that there is a single equation called Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem was invented by a mathematician named Thomas Bayes, who was just a bird watcher. Literally, he just came up with this because he was a rich dude in England who was like, I like watching birds, and I'm not sure if that's like a cardinal or a sparrow. So he's like, well, if I'm not sure what I'm looking at, how can I determine what it is? And then he started realizing he needed glasses, or I'm not sure, but that's the apocryphal story I've heard. And he realized there's two layers to this. It's not just what does he think he sees, it's how much does he trust his source. And that was the heart of Bayes' equation. You take any belief that has two possibilities. Aliens at Area 51, no aliens at Area 51, right?
Mm-hmm.
Compare all the evidence for one side or the other, and then multiply those things by how much you trust the source. So, for example, if there's 100 sources saying there are aliens at Area 51, but like 99 of them are incentivized to make money by selling you stuff to believe it, and
Mm-hmm.
there's only two sources saying there aren't, but they have 100% reason to be true, you multiply the amount of evidence by the trustworthiness of that evidence, and you get a final ratio of how much you should believe stuff. That's it. That's the core of it. Just start asking yourself that with every single belief in your life. How much do I believe this percentage wise? And then ask yourself, how much do I trust the source? And if you just iterate on those two things, you're a rationalist, in my opinion.
And is that why it goes back to a lot of rationalists get caught up in analysis paralysis and they refuse to go the second step and act upon it because they're so busy, like, all right, I got to get more data?
Yes, exactly. And I'm not even against that. I fall into that trap too. I'm just as human as everyone else. I just try to encourage people, like, when you notice you've waited more than a week to do something, throw some chaos into it. Just do something because it will introduce more data, and then you might be able to make a clearer decision.
Gotcha. And I'm curious from what you learned in your journey of going through, it sounds like very hard times and really kind of building yourself back from maybe behind square one. What are those? I like to think about things from like a Pareto principle of like 20% of the things are making 80% of the difference. What do you think were those 20% of the things? Was it figuring out accountability? Was it figuring out your Pearl system? Like what were those things that led you to where you are now?
I think most people who are going to be interested in this podcast in the guild are the kind of people who like self improvement anyway.
Mm.
And I think there's always a phase where you just consume a lot. Like, I read all the Tim Ferriss things. I'm sure there is like a rich dad, poor dad. Just consume as much as you can for a while. And then understand that no one system is going to work exactly for you, and it's more about throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And if you do this with enough techniques, what will happen is you will kind of create your own ad hoc system. The best advice I can give is actually from the show BoJack Horseman, where
Okay.
there's like a scene where he passes out, and you've been seeing the one snow monkey character running in front of his place, and he looks at him. He's like, "Does it get easier?" And the monkey's like, "Yeah, it gets easier every day, but you got to make yourself do it every day. That's the hard part."
Mm.
And as for that, and that's not in like that's not small. The best answer I found is to make yourself accountable to other people. Like, if you really are having trouble doing it for yourself, do it for others.
Yeah.
Humans, all experiences are like multiplied when shared. If you want to
Yeah.
be a better chef for your own health, that's great. Start cooking for your friends once a week. It'll force you way more than saying like I'm gonna like meal prep on Sundays. If your friends are coming on Saturday, you'll get a lot better at it. That's
Personal
kind of
development is sort of paradoxical in that way, in that so it's
it
almost
is.
most effective when you're doing it for other people.
Well, if you want to get political, I think that that's kind of a side effect of our really messed up hyper individualistic system. Like, there are lots of examples from socialist and leftist circles throughout history where they understood that making yourself better is an act of giving to your community. Like, you're by being your best self, you help the community. And I this is also a big belief of mine. Always listen to the people who you absolutely disagree with and find the best version of them, because it is often very enlightening. And if you want to hear the best version of leftist critique, check out Chapo Trap House, the
Okay.
funniest podcast I've ever heard in my life. And they make it really clear, and they nail it on the head a lot. Every force in our society is pushing us to be alone, to be individualized, to not trust strangers, to not help each other, and to be scrambling for ourselves. So, clearly, if things are wrong and that's where everything is pushing us, we should do the opposite. I mean, it's probably not the right idea, but it's definitely not in the wrong direction.
Hmm. How do you think about oneness? Because I want to take this in a spiritual direction. You went political with it, but I'm curious. A lot of organized religion is some form of community building to where maybe it's Zen Buddhism or maybe it's another branch, but they say pull all the way out of yourself and encompass this universal energy. How do you guys think about that at the guild, or maybe how do you think about that personally?
I can't speak for the rest of the guild, but as for myself, I have had transcendent moments, both under the influence of psychedelics and completely stone cold sober, where I wasn't David anymore. I lost the part of my mind that is able to distinguish me from my outside environment entirely. And it is a truly surreal experience that I highly recommend everyone have at least once. But you can't stay there. It's not a state of being that is functional for the long term, because it decouples you from earthly wants and needs, which sounds great for your own goals, but it also means you don't feel like helping others. I think that it's an antidote to the myopic narcissism of our society. But just like everything else, the medicine is in the dosage. You don't want to stay in that state that long. Like, the example that me and Matt Freeman, one of our founders, have talked about is we've both done lots of meditation throughout our lives. But we both realized that somewhere around 100 hours or so, we kind of stopped doing it because we realized we were becoming so disconnected that things that should alarm us didn't. Like Matt's example is, he felt so at peace that he looked at his child and he's like, I don't know if I would feel sad if they died right now. And he's like, oh, this is why they made like samurai meditate all the time. It literally disconnects you from your humanity if you do it enough. Now, I still meditate occasionally, but there is like a break off point. Like, when I meet people who meditate to the point of Zen all the time, they look to me like a bodybuilder on steroids. Like, you've gone so far down this route that I don't think it's healthy anymore.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there in terms of one of the other principles, I guess, is non-attachment. So it sounds like you guys both reached the point of meditation or maybe transcendence to where you achieved total non-attachment. And your view, if I'm understanding it correctly, is that you need a certain amount of attachment to serve the people around you and to sort of be a
Yeah,
functioning member of society.
yeah. Like, I'm pretty sure if you have any listeners who are Buddhists, you can correct me on this, but I think the term is bodhisattva, which is the term for a Buddha who got enlightened, but instead of breaking out of the cycle of reincarnation, chooses to come back to Earth to help other people along theirs. And I think that's kind of a religious version of my goal with the guild,
Mm-hmm.
to be the kind of person who could break out, could become a billionaire, could become a YouTube celebrity, and maybe does do those things. We're not against success, but instead of just choosing to do that and isolate yourself, goes back and helps the people who came before you on the same path.
And what elements do you focus on when you're talking to someone in the guild and saying, I understand you want to achieve these goals, that's one side of it, but you also have to dive into yourself. And what elements of self do you kind of focus on?
Well, one of the things we do is we have them do a character sheet when they first come in, which is an analysis of who they are. Like, what was your past life? How do you narrativize your own past? What do you think about your present? What would you like for your future? And it's boring, tedious work, but it's important. And then on top of that, we have some tools like the Big Five personality test we are getting integrated into our website that we've had people do before, because the Big Five is one of the only psychological tests that replicates pretty well. And knowing just some of why things are helps. Like, for example, conscientiousness is one of the Big Five personality traits. It's both how polite you are, how organized and clean and stuff like that. It's actually the number one related factors to success. Intelligence is number two.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I score in the bottom 2 percentile of
Oh,
conscientiousness.
David.
It's terrible. I literally did
Oh,
the test, and they
no.
were like, if you were in a room with 100 people, 97 of them would be more conscientious than you. I
The
was like, oh
long tail.
no.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
no, no.
So that was depressing, but it meant that, like, if I wanted real dividends, that's where I should invest my energy. That's where my
Mm,
weak point was. Like, I am very much of the stoic mindset, which is instead of trying to maximize what you're already good at, because in my belief, it could always get taken away from you, I'm rather good with my words and I'm pretty clever. But what if I got into a car accident, got into a brain injury? If I double down on the thing I'm already good at, and then something catastrophic happens, a black swan, I'm shit out of luck. Whereas if you're always working on your weaknesses, you're always breaking through the bottlenecks and you make yourself resilient to whatever life throws at you.
yeah. I like that a lot.
So when we talk to people in the guild, I usually try to help them figure out what is the bottleneck, the thing holding them back the most. And then we have some basic processes to try to help them do it. Like, first of all, let's just do the research. Has anyone else experienced the same problem? Maybe the answer is really just you need to buy a $80 Roomba. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes it's super simple. Let's always hope that the answer is simple. Then, after that, if it isn't, let's gradually increase the intensity of what we're going to try up to the comfort level, and maybe just a little bit past the comfort level of our students, but never beyond what they would consent to and what they are okay with.
And I guess as a final question, because I'm curious, you mentioned that you're kind of going through a workout routine right now, right? Or kind of a
Yeah.
physical workout stuff. A lot of that in the initial part, when you, let's say you're going to the gym, you start lifting weights, a lot of it is pretty uncomfortable and pretty friction filled to start. And then you hit a certain point where maybe it becomes a habit, or maybe you just realize the endorphins going through your body and you start to crave it. And I'm curious, like, how you think about that trajectory of there's a lot of uncomfortableness, you're not getting into a flow state, you're experiencing friction all the way to the point of this is a habit, this is an identity, this is something I crave.
Oh, It sucks, and the only way I got around it is I got a personal trainer and started doing boxing classes. I used social pressure
Mm.
because so I was very lucky. My trainer, Thomas Smalls Jr., he's online. I'll always talk him up. I've been working with him for 2 years. When he first started, he was like, "Hey, I would love to build my portfolio, so I'm willing to offer you a very good deal monthly in exchange if you would like, be a before and after." I was like, "I'd be happy to do this." And he asked me what time, and I was like, 7 a.m. I hate waking up in the morning, but this forced me to go because if I canceled, he's been up since 5 a.m. I'm such an asshole. If like I literally like don't if I don't call him at least the night before, I'm the jerk.
Yeah.
So that helped with the first 3 months. Then I started saying like, okay, all the things that I'm feeling that are frictionful, I can't be the first person to have experienced them. So I started looking up like results. So Renaissance Periodization is a great website. It's a company all of PhDs who are also bodybuilders and professional athletes.
Oh no, this sounds like a dangerous army, guerrilla army.
Oh my God. Renaissance Periodization and Dr. Mike Israetel are the most brilliant people about physical fitness I've ever seen online, and the only ones with a scientific approach that like is replicatable.
Okay.
And they were talking about like muscle soreness. And one of the things they mentioned is muscle soreness is often a result of lack of protein at night. So have a protein shake or casein powder at night. It'll keep your metabolism going and it'll give your body protein. Just making that one small change meant that those first 3 months became a lot easier because the
Mm.
soreness levels went down hugely.
Mm.
And yeah, I used social obligation to get me through that friction period. And I think that's how a lot of people get good at things, at least until they're a habit.
Yeah.
And there's
And
nothing
then,
wrong with that. It's fun. It's how you bond with people.
yeah, I love that you guys have thought so deeply about the social connection of personal development because I think it's like you said, it's so linked with the outside world and the way to motivate ourselves, which doesn't happen from watching motivational videos. It comes from within. Is so much, what can I do for the people around me?
It's, I mean, one of the big influences has been Dune. I read Dune when I was a kid, and a lot of our founders have as well. And the idea of groups like the Mentats and the Bene Gesserits, people who have learned to improve themselves to such a high capacity that they almost seem superhuman, but are restrained because they feel obligation either to their lords or to humanity as a whole, is one thing that has really inspired me. I think of any author, Frank Herbert has probably changed me the most because he's given me that long term perspective.
Mhm.
By the way, the new
David,
Dune movie, so good.
it was fantastic. I
Oh my
remember
God,
reading the
yes.
book as a kid and I didn't like remember it as much. So yeah, maybe there's a weird connection between who's read Dune as a child. Of people
I
interested in
mean,
this stuff.
I think it's something where it's like the first time you read Dune and you're like, oh, humans could potentially do this. Like, even if it's not true, the fact that someone imagined that they could really opens up what you hope humans can do altogether.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, David, this has been very interesting. I do want to give you a chance to tell people where they can find you, where they should go for Guild of the Rose information, all that.
Well, we are very easy to find online. We are the guildoftherose.org. Guildoftherose.org. We have lots of classes currently. I believe the next one we have is on street epistemology, which is the act of learning how to productively disagree with anyone. We also have a bunch of them. If you guys are interested, all of our materials are free. You only have to sign up to join a cohort. Our goal here is obviously to be successful, but we're a triple bottom line business and we are worker cooperative by structure. So we're trying to make sure that we are not just trying to make money, but trying to help our communities, help the people who are working with us. I mean, if you guys join, you're what matters most. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be on. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, I hope this isn't the last time we chat, but I hope you have a great rest of your week, David.
You too, man.
And thank you for tuning in for another episode of the Flowably podcast. At Flowably, our mission is to train professionals across every industry on how to unlock productivity and wellness through flow. Visit our website, flowably.io, and schedule a free discovery call to learn more about the tools you can use to optimize your performance and well-being. We'll see you next time.